Hello there again, Jed Irvin here, and we're going to take another pass at the student-advisor collaboration. I've heard a number of students over the years lament to me that their advisor expects too much of them, expects them to do too much work. Well, in any collaboration, there's always the question of who does which work and how much of it do they do? And the student-advisor collaboration is no different. Now let's think about this collaboration from both sides and try to think, what would each collaborator think is the ideal situation? First, let's take the student. A student might hope that the advisor gives them lots of direction, remembers what the student's constraints are as far as how much other workload they have and what their skill sets are. The advisor is going to let me focus on what I think is interesting. And the advisor is going to give me a reasonable amount of work given the constraints that I have. Now let's think about the perfect collaboration from the advisor's point of view. They might hope that the student is self-motivated, that they need less direction as time goes on. They hope the student stays engaged on whatever piece of the research project they need the student to work on. They'd hope that the student would do the work of managing their own workload between balancing classwork and research work. They would hope that the student always delivers what's expected, and they'd want the student to increase their skill set as time goes by. Now, some of these are clearly in tension. Think about your constraints and workload. Well, in the last video, we talked about the spoke and wheel metaphor, where the advisor is rotating through students and also other work, and when they get to your perhaps weekly meeting, they're not going to remember anything about what's going on with you. They'll have no idea what classes you're taking. They'll probably have no idea what they asked you to do the previous week. So this means it's very likely that you're going to need to speak up when things aren't aligning correctly. And we'll cover this in a number of videos actually, but we'll start covering speaking up in the next video on collaboration bandwidth. On the question of you focusing on what you think is interesting, this is a complicated question. And it all starts with how research projects are funded. So a professor will be part of a grant proposal that's in response to some funding agency saying, send us your ideas. And the grant proposal will have a certain amount of ideas in it, and will say it'll cost this much money because we need this many students to work on it and such. If they are lucky enough to get accepted for that grant, then at some point the actual workings of that grant and the specifics of the requirements will be worked out. Those are never set up front because the funding agency doesn't know what ideas are going to be there. So after all the ideas have been selected and put into play, then the professor will know, okay, this is what we're going to do in general. Now, if the project is big enough, there may be multiple institutions involved, and sometimes the funding agency will even hire a separate group to do evaluations. And depending on how they do evaluations, that might force some amount of the work you do into kind of a more deliverable kind of focus, like a software engineering focus, versus a pure research focus. And so it's a balance. You'll get research funding, but sometimes you'll need to deliver stuff. So the absolute worst case is that you might be very interested in what the professor is focusing on, and when the work comes that you're needed for, it winds up being something you're not that interested in, and what you're interested in is like way over there. So first, I'll play the advisor's advocate for a moment to say that any project you work on is going to be a learning opportunity. Even if it's not something that the focus of what you're doing is exactly what you're most interested in, you're going to learn things. And at the end of this project, those things you will have learned, you will not need to learn them later. You will be a more well-rounded person and ready for more challenges. More doors will be open to you because of what you learned. But it will be very frustrating for you if you're like, I just want to be focusing on this, and you're not doing that. So this is a situation where you really need to speak up to the professor and share your truth. Say, thanks for having me on this project. I'm in this pickle though, because I was really interested in focusing on this, and now you have me doing this, and can you help me figure out something, how to make this work? And so that's an important conversation to have. What you don't want to do is suffer in silence for months and months and months and drag your feet and be miserable and just not be an engaged member of the team because of this problem. There may be a chance that the advisor might be able to do some adjustments, or they might say, you know, if you pull through on this task, then maybe we'll get you on this other thing that's more interesting. And I've seen that happen a bunch of times. There's a bunch more I want to share about this journey of time that the student and advisor will go through from start to finish of the degree on the question of which work each collaborator does and how much of it they do. Regardless of how that's lining up or not lining up at one point, that's going to need to change over time, because there's kind of an arc of development for both a master's student and a PhD student. But I'm not going to talk through it in the video because I've already talked through it in one of the podcast episodes in the Grad Student Coach podcasts. So before you move on to the next video, I'd like you to listen to episode 3 of the podcast, which is called Employee versus Entrepreneur. Check that out, and then we'll see you in the next video.